Alright, The Hurt Locker. Now I recently just saw this movie for the first time and I thought it was pretty great. This movie was also directed by Catherine Bigelow, who also directed Near Dark, which I just found out somewhat recently. Near Dark was a pretty good movie that I enjoyed and I reviewed it before if you're more interested to see my thoughts. But as for this movie, I thought it was pretty great and it does such a great job of being so authentically real and tense throughout the entire scene. Authenticity is what this movie really does well in my opinion. The way that the entire camera and visual style of this movie is presented makes it feel very authentic and sort of like a documentary. A lot of this movie is handheld camera, so it does have that realistic kind of gritty feel to it, and it does a really great job of making this entire movie feel as if it's very intense and stressful. The editing of this movie also comes to mind, and it's something that was very well done and helped fit the style of the movie. Another thing that I really appreciated about the presentation to this movie was the lack of music and how little there is in the entire movie. It does a really great job putting you into the center of the action and tension and atmosphere of this movie. Another thing that works very well for this type of movie would be the story structure and kind of lack of story structure, if that makes sense. The way that this movie is presented is not so much a 3-act structure or even a strongly structured narrative, but rather a more episodic journey involving 3 main characters in different situations. It really works well to comment on the chaos of war and unpredictability in that element, but also serves as a really good character study as it allows just these 3 main characters to have a lot of time to interact with each other in different situations. The acting of this movie was pretty good and worked for the film. I felt the writing for the main character did a very good job of exploring ideas and concepts as to his kind of adrenaline rush throughout the entire movie. I'm sure there's a lot more to pick up on a second watch, but for right now I'm just going to comment on what I saw in the first one. The way that he approaches certain situations is obviously very different from how other teammates approach certain situations. It really does make him stand out and establish his personality and kind of his problem that he has with this. There's a specific scene near the end of the movie that really demonstrates the contrast between him and another character throughout this film. It's a truly emotional scene with some great acting from both of them, but I will say this goes into something that I kind of mentioned earlier. I praise this movie for how little music there was in this entire film, but during this scene they decided to add the score to it, and I just feel like the movie would have worked so much better if the music was just absent from that scene. In all honesty, it was kind of distracting. There were some truly great emotional concepts and ideas and performances throughout that scene, but the music was honestly just a detriment to it in my opinion. And while I'm on complaints of this movie, I might as well mention that some minor characters that show up throughout the film feel a little bit more cartoonish and not as fleshed out and just one-sided or one-dimensional in my opinion. That's not a huge deal, and overall I thought this movie was pretty great, but that's a criticism nonetheless. No, overall this movie was pretty great and I'm very excited to recommend it to people, and this one gets a very easy 8 out of 10. And I also got around to watching the movie Us. This was directed and written by Jordan Peele, who also wrote and directed Get Out and Nope, 2 pretty great movies who I gave an 8 out of 10 and 7 out of 10. Definitely watch those movies before you watch this. But as for this movie, it's definitely the weaker out of the 3, and that doesn't mean it's bad necessarily, it just drops the ball in a few places in those movies. But this movie does have some aspects to it that I really enjoyed and appreciated. One of those aspects being the main actress's performance. She does an absolutely great job performing 2 characters in this movie and is able to bring both distinctiveness to both of them. It's really memorable in my opinion. I think she's the best actor in the entire movie in my opinion. The other actors were pretty great and fit their characters very well. They all did a great job and were serviceable for the film, with exception to the little girl at the beginning of the movie. She wasn't terrible by any means, but she was just not really that believable in my opinion. She kind of shows up throughout the film here and there, but she's not terrible. It's not too much of a detriment to the movie in my opinion, but it is just something I noticed and thought I should mention. I really appreciated the pacing to this movie and how it built up the world and characters and atmosphere of this movie. Something that Jordan Peele really excels at in my opinion is reincorporating elements into his film, and I thought he did a great job with this one. There are some nice setups here and there that didn't feel too obvious and were well thought out. Now, something that I should mention in this movie is that this movie has some very clearly symbolic elements and nature throughout the film, and it's not really a criticism or much of a compliment. It's just a bit of a mishmash of what this movie's trying to say or kind of convey. I thought I should mention it because it is something that affected my experience and I just don't know how I feel about it right now. I did overall enjoy the main theme and score composed for this movie and thought that it was well used and well thought out, but I have to say for the other licensed music in this movie, it was just not very well presented at all. It felt very poorly thought out with how the music would be used into the film. It just felt kind of unfitting in those scenes that it showed up in. Now, just like Get Out Out and Nope, this movie has both comedic and horror elements to it, but they were so much better presented in those movies than in this one. In this one, it feels as if it has difficulty discerning whether it wants to be comedic or horror aspects throughout a certain scene. And in all honesty, there are certain scenes that are almost completely ruined by the attempt at comedy that goes into it. There are worse offenders than this, and some of the scenes do work well with what the characters are going through and the build up to that certain point in the movie, but there were definitely a lot of distracting moments throughout this film as well. Now, I mentioned that the pacing of this movie was well done, but near the end of the movie it began to feel as if it was wasting time. I felt a little bit uninvested throughout the ending part of this film and just felt that it could have been shorter and didn't need to be that long. And at the end of this movie, I felt that the twist that they presented was just kind of stupid in my opinion. Not only can you see it being set up and kind of clued into the fact before they reveal it, but it just really fails to add anything to the movie in my opinion. And it is kind of one of those stupid bait and switch moments I think didn't really pan out well. But overall, this movie was not terrible and I definitely enjoyed parts of it. It just kind of dropped the ball here and there. Definitely watch Nope and Get Out before you watch this one. And this one gets a 6 out of 10. Alright, The Banshees of Inisherin. This was a pretty good movie and I enjoyed it a lot. This is from the same director as 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which I reviewed in a previous episode. If you want to hear more of my thoughts about it, then go definitely watch that episode. But for right now, I really enjoyed that movie. It had some issues in my opinion, but I'm excited to watch it again. And I think I'm leaning towards liking this movie a little bit more than that movie. What really works for this movie for me personally would be the overall tone and personality of this film, not to mention its very clever and witty comedic writing. I found the personality of this film to be distinctly memorable in my mind. There are so many enjoyable, interesting, and weird and funny characters throughout this film. The 2 main characters played by Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson did a great job with their performances and felt as if they fit their characters rather well. Their dynamic relationship throughout the movie was also very well done. A lot of the movie does rest upon, and they have such a great dynamic with each other, and it really brings this movie to life. As I said earlier, every character in this movie has their own distinct personality and are very memorable to me. The dialogue in this movie is incredibly well written and feels very well researched beforehand. It also feels very in time period and brings a certain realism to the movie. Another thing about this film would be the surrealist nature of it. There are clearly some ideas and concepts going on in this movie that I really enjoyed and would be paying more attention to on my second watch. The cinematography in this movie was also something that was fairly well done. There's some really nice cinematography here and there, and it's very professionally presented in my opinion. A lot of this film was filmed on location, so that's commendable for it, and it certainly brings a realism to the movie. The comedy writing in this movie was also pretty great. It's very genuine, clever, and witty, and managed to get a laugh out of me a few times. Now overall, I definitely enjoyed this movie, and it certainly was a very fun, kind of weird watch, so this one gets a very strong 7 out of 10. I'm also very excited to talk about Lord of War, directed by Andrew Niccol and starring Nicolas Cage. Now this movie was written and directed by Andrew Niccol, who also wrote The Truman Show. I've only seen The Truman Show once and I remember enjoying it. I'll have to watch it again to really solidify my opinions about it, but I absolutely love this movie. Now Nicolas Cage has certainly built up the reputation over the years of having a variety of different performances in his movies. Not all good, by the way. He fit his character in this movie just so incredibly well. There's such a great level of care and thought put into the writing to this character. An aspect that really helps develop Nick Cage's character throughout this entire film would be the narration throughout the film. In other movies, narration is used as a lazy tool to just pointlessly describe things to the audience and exposition dumps. And there are points in this movie where the narration does serve to explain things to the audience. But what's really key here is that it never feels as an overly done exposition dump, and it really does a great job helping keep the pacing alive and making this movie so fun to watch. But above all else, the narration does a really great job of developing Nick Cage's characters as it allows him to show his certain personality throughout certain lines. There are lines in the narration that are just so cynical and nihilistic, and the way that Nick Cage just delivers them so casually says a lot about his character. And that truly is what makes the narration in this movie so well done, is that it adds to his character and explores his personality. Another thing in this movie is that I found Nicolas Cage's and Jared Leto's relationship to be very well developed and explored. There's a certain level of controlling that Nicolas Cage's character goes through on Jared Leto's character, and I think it does say something about their relationship and dynamic. Not to mention that almost every single character in this movie has a lot of personality and is very well written. The way that some characters are introduced certainly do leave a lot to show their personality and presence right from their first scene. An example of this would be Iman Walker's character's introduction. Now overall, the writing in this movie is pretty fantastic, and it does such a great job of making the pacing feel so alive and fast paced. It just honestly feels like this movie flies so by, and something that really helps this movie with the editing and song choices throughout certain scenes. The movie does a really great job of utilizing certain songs into certain scenes and making it feel really energetic and engaging. The opening title sequence is one that comes to mind. There are so many others that I can almost just imagine perfectly because of the music. The final two scenes in this movie really come to mind. There's just so much raw, powerful emotion in both of these, and they do such a great job to end the movie. The second to last scene in this movie is so well done, with great performances from Nicolas Cage and Ethan Hawke, and the very ending of this movie does such a great job of sticking out in my mind, especially with how the music and narration are both utilized. The music is a very faint but powerful guitar song. It's done so well of just being very subtle and quiet, but it adds just so much to the scene. Not to mention the narration from Nick Cage does such a great job of explaining his character and personality, and just his perspective at that point in the film. It's kind of cynical, but it fits the movie just so well and everything that's been leading up to that point. And that scene definitely left me with a lot to think about. Now anyways, I really love this movie and I can't wait to recommend it to people. So for right now, this movie gets a very high 8 out of 10. I might change it to a 9 later, depending on my second watch, but right now let's just leave it at very high 8.